It's time to change the conversation about mental health.
When you know something is wrong.
When you feel alone.
When you can't explain what hurts.
When every day is a struggle.
When you can't ask for help.
When your friend or family member seems fine on the outside,
but hurts on the inside.
Sometimes I feel as though I'm the only one that feels. But I know that's not true.
We can change.
We can change.
We can change.
We can make a difference.
There's power in our difference.
We can support each other.
We can fight stigma.
We say it's okay.
It's okay.
It's okay to have a mental health condition.
We all want to feel heard.
To find hope.
And to live in a world without stigma.
Without discrimination.
And we are a force to be reckoned with.
I am not what happened to me.
I am how I overcame it.
Stand with us.
In discrimination in mental health.
You can see the person, not the condition.
You can build understanding.
You can play your part.
The conversation changes with me.
With me.
With me.
We are well-beings.
We are all well-beings.
WETA, with a coalition of partners, welcomes you to the Well-Beings Youth Mental Health Project. Hi, I'm Bill Pullman, and I'm honored to be with you as we launch this national campaign from public media. Well-Beings is a groundbreaking project at a very important point in time. Mental illness disproportionately affects our young people and the most disadvantaged populations among us. The growing mental health movement has set the stage for dramatic change, to raise awareness, to reduce stigma, to focus on prevention and early intervention, and the promise of more research for new treatments. Together, we can bring mental illness and discrimination out of the shadows, and it's not a day too soon. So thank you for being here today.
The signature documentary series in the Well-Beings campaign is Ken Burns Presents Hiding in Plain Sight, Our Mental Health Crisis. Produced and directed by Ewers Brothers Productions and written by David Blistine, the film will explore through lived experiences the youth mental health crisis in our country. Currently in production, this 4-hour documentary is slated to air on PBS station in spring of 2022.
Wellbeings.org and #Wellbeings will be adding new content every week, including
Brave Teens, a digital feature-length documentary that offers a candid portrait of the lives of teens who have decided it's time to talk about their mental health challenges, to support one another, and to end stigma.
Out of the Dark, a short-form digital series that profiles the stories of 3 young people who faced the greatest mental health challenge of their lives and found strength they never knew they had.
Little actions make a big difference. A new animated series shares easy-to-use, science-based tools, actions, and tactics to support your social-emotional health and well-being.
And Tell My Story, a digital documentary in which a grieving father seeks answers after his 14-year-old son dies by suicide. He uncovers painful truths about the lives of teens, the impact of social media, and the shocking rise of depression among America's youth.
PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Labs engage high school journalism students as correspondents that report on youth mental health for more than 150 high schools across 46 states.
Access to mental health services in our country is already plagued by structural inequality. Now it has been exacerbated by a pandemic and brought into sharp focus yet again due to the killing of George Floyd and subsequent protests against racial injustice and police brutality. This is contributing to a sharp increase in anxiety, depression, and challenges the mental health and well-being of our young people.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cara Santa Maria, host of the PBS SoCal, KCET, and KPCC daily news series, SoCal Update. I'm also a PhD candidate in clinical psychology with a concentration in social justice and diversity from Fielding Graduate University. Thank you for joining us for PBS SoCal and KCET's live stream event as part of the Wellbeings Tour on youth mental health. This campaign was created by the Washington, D.C. public media station WETA, along with national sponsors and partners. Thank you to all supporters for helping us shine a light on this very important issue. The Wellbeings campaign addresses critical health needs in America through broadcast content, original digital content, and impactful local events across the entire country. The campaign begins with the Youth Mental Health Project, engaging youth voices to create a national conversation, raise awareness, address stigma and discrimination, and encourage compassion. Tonight's conversation is called Lowering Barriers: Race, Income, and Mental Health. This past year has been difficult. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and America's reckoning around race is changing how we live our daily lives. For youth that come from low-income families and from communities of color, there are decades and sometimes centuries-old structures that create barriers to access the mental health resources needed. Our goal tonight is to unpack how the systems and environment that surround a young person can have an impact on how they will view and access mental health support services. In addition to talking about challenges and changes that need to be made, we also want to share resources that are currently available and discuss great work being done to make mental health care more accessible for Southern California's youth. Thank you for local support from our partners at We Rise, a month-long initiative of the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, offering a series of free COVID-safe community programs, events, and experiences highlighting the healing powers of art and connection during Mental Health Awareness Month in May. And thank you again to the Wellbeing's national partners and sponsors who've made this event possible today. As we have this conversation, please feel free to join in with questions and comments and be a part of the discussion at the Wellbeing's Facebook or YouTube page. Also, we ask that you take the event survey at wellbeings.org/PBS SoCal, as your insights help us to craft future Wellbeing's events. Before we jump into this conversation, we want to help frame and define what we mean when we say a young person's environment affects their mental health. This next clip is from the KCET original documentary Power and Health, which examines the role of power in our society and how it can be reshaped through community, belonging, and inclusion in order to reshape our health. Let's watch to find out more about the link between socioeconomic conditions and our well-being.
When you think about the things we all need to be healthy and to be happy and to be living our full lives, you think about the work we might do. You think about the relationships that are most important and how you make sure you have enough time for them. And then you think about where you live, what it feels like to come home, the neighborhood, and where you are. And I think that that is what the social determinants of health are all about.
People talk about the social determinants of health as those determinants of health and illness that are outside of the individual. So they're beyond our individual genes, they're beyond our individual behaviors, they are in fact the context of our lives.
The social determinants of health are all of the things that surround us and that we experience.
What's available to us and how much it costs in terms of food, healthcare. And then there are some of us who can easily walk out of our house in the morning and walk around and be comfortable doing that and be able to get our exercise that way, be able to see our neighbors, be able to have fun. And those of us who doing that is actually dangerous. And it's not just the danger that impacts our health. It's the stress of that danger. And chronic stress has huge impacts on what it means for us and our health.
We know it from the biology. So if you don't have control over your life and forces are mostly acting upon you, you're in a state of reactivity all of the time. And that kind of hijacks your body into physiological manifestations that are not good for your health. Your immune system, your brain function, endocrine pathways, so the way that hormones affect your brain function and your immune system, the ways in which your experiences and the environment you're in affect how your genes are regulated. So what genes get turned on or turned off that have different health effects.
We're down over 16% and seeing a 600-point loss.
I'll give you one example of a study that we did that looked at foreclosure, home foreclosure, when we had the Great Recession. And we showed very clearly that that home foreclosure is associated with greater risk for depression. Now, we're talking about clinical depression, real, serious depression symptoms that are debilitating. Depression then is associated with all sorts of physical illness. It's associated with diabetes, associated with obesity, associated with heart disease. That means that if your home is getting foreclosed on, you are more likely to have diabetes. And we do not tend to make that connection. We tend to think of diabetes and heart disease as in the realm of doctors. But the lesson that's been learned over the past several decades of science is that ultimately what causes these conditions is the world around you. And being foreclosed on, being displaced from your home, is one of those causes.
It doesn't take a lot of fancy studies to show that a person who is struggling with just meeting their basic needs and is not able to drive their life with a purpose that they've chosen has less good health than others.
Now that we've defined the social determinants of health, let's dive into our first panel conversation. We have an all-star group joining us today to talk about current barriers young people face when it comes to accessing mental health resources. Join me in welcoming Dr. Manuel Pastor, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Director of the USC Equity Research Institute, Roshan Davis, Intermediate Typist Clerk for LA County and Psychology student at Cal State LA, and Catherine Yeom, Executive Director of Korean American Family Services. Let's get started. So, Dr. Pastor, I want to start with you. You study the conditions facing low-income urban communities, and the clip we just watched speaks to the social determinants of health. Can you let us know more about how the world we live in can impact our mental health?
Well, I think the clip is quite informative and really fills out the story. But when you're experiencing economic insecurity, that causes stress. When you feel like your community is the target of bad policing and you feel like you're neither safe from gangs and violence nor safe from the police, that causes stress and mental trauma. When you live in a mixed status family where you or one of your relatives is undocumented and there's the constant threat of deportation, that causes stress and mental trauma. And when you've just lived through this COVID period in which this is the disease that revealed our illnesses as a society, the sort of pre-existing conditions of economic and social disparity that left people behind. And you begin to understand that the society did not value your life, that the society allowed COVID to rip its way through immigrant communities, Black communities, Pacific Islander communities, without really addressing it in a serious way. That causes a sense of being devalued and displaced. And so I think every signal that the society is giving to many communities of color is that they are less than. And that causes a particular form of mental trauma. Often in our own communities of color, we think, well, you should just tough up and work your way through this, be tougher. But we need to accept the fact that these are real traumas, and we need both to have the larger society recognize this and do the work within our own communities to break down the resistance to accepting mental health help that sometimes exists.
Those are such important points. So, Roshan, I do want to turn to you. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey with mental health? What led you to be a mental health advocate?
Yes, sure. So I recently entered my Trisarian decade of life. I have always had underlying mental health issues. I wouldn't consider any of them chronic, but slightly mild during certain stages of my life. And I grew up in the Los Angeles County foster care system from the age 5 to 21. And I truly believe that most of the issues I faced when I was a grade school child, adolescents, and young adults stem from the experiences I had moving from foster home to foster home and never really having a fair chance to create long-lasting relationships. What I mean by this is I reached young adulthood. It was a challenge for me to build close relationships with others, work in group assignments, or even trust people. Um, I wanted to connect, I just didn't know how. Some barriers I faced as a young person was acquiring mental health services such as quality therapy for a reasonable price.
And that's especially concerning considering that you were within a system that should almost make those kinds of services easier to access. But in many ways, you were faced with even more barriers than those in the broader community. I'd love to now turn it to Catherine. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your organization, Korean American Family Services. What barriers are you trying to address with your work, especially, within youth populations?
So, Korean American Family Services is a nonprofit founded in 1983, located in the heart of Koreatown. And our mission is to empower underserved Korean American and Asian Pacific Islander families through culturally responsive programs. We serve about 10,000 unduplicated individuals with services in mental health, domestic and family violence, and foster care every year. With our youth population, the top barriers we address is the lack of mental health education because the structure, is created by Western ideas and social shame for receiving mental health care services and lack of mental health professionals who are culturally competent. We continue to educate our youth of mental health care services and that it is okay to get professional help, which are foreign concepts to Asian American youths. We remind our youth that we have counselors that look like you, who are raised in bicultural homes, have gone through similar experiences, and have a shared understanding of the cultural needs and values one might need.
I'd love to switch gears and talk a little bit about stigma. And Dr. Pastor, something that you brought up here was that beyond barriers to access, there are also sometimes these community level barriers that prevent young people from talking about and getting help. So Catherine, back to you. Can you speak a little to the role stigma plays in your work in Korean and East Asian American communities?
So in Asian American culture, especially in East Asian American communities, there's a notion of saving face or loss of face, which is to keep all family matters private within the walls of the homes. And if you ask for help, it's a sign of weakness and brings shame to the family's reputation. So these are some things that we see with stigma, and also the Asian model minority myth that all Asians are perfect. They excel in academics, are independent, and are all, economically secure. So it makes it harder for Asian Americans to ask for help because of this assumption. And we've seen in many of our clients who end up choosing to ask for help, they're usually at their last thread, holding their life together, bottling emotions for decades and fighting intergenerational trauma. And it's very common. There's have been so many studies that show that Asian Americans are the least racial group to seek mental health services. And this is all due to the community and cultural stigma that's behind it.
Roshan, I'd be interested to hear in your personal journey. Can you point to any time or any experience in which stigma really played a role in your transition from not receiving mental health services to now really kind of becoming an advocate in this world?
Yes. So the most prevalent experience that come to mind is my experience striving to graduate high school. I went to 12 different high schools because I frequently moved around and I missed a lot of the basics, in algebra, biology, and English. So I kind of struggled. And when I mustered up the courage in my senior year to talk to my teachers, I was always met with negative criticism, such as maybe you're just not trying enough, or everybody else in the class is doing fine. I don't understand why you're having an issue, and it took a jab at my self esteem and even like my self worth. Like, wow, I'm not worth investing in, and it triggered some of my childhood abandonment issues. A 17-year-old me, I wasn't even aware that I had these traumatic experiences. Um, so
Right. Even developing that kind of insight does take the work and some of the, the resources that are available, these mental health services that we've been discussing. This conversation about stigma surrounding mental health ties into a story produced by students at Daniel Pearl Magnet High School in Los Angeles. These students are part of PBS NewsHour's youth journalism program called Student Reporting Labs. Let's take a look.
Taking that first step is kind of scary. Like sitting in that chair, speaking to someone. It was really hard. I'm not someone who tells people things easily. It took me about a month to actually do it. From my initial thought of getting help, it took me about a month to fully convince myself. And in the end, I didn't even seek out help. I asked my friend if she could tell the social worker. I was waking up throughout the night a lot and I couldn't sleep. And I would wake up out of breath. I couldn't breathe. I was very disoriented. My family and I had thought like it was part of my asthma because I'm asthmatic. So we went to the doctor and the doctor told us that it was panic attacks. He diagnosed me with general anxiety and depression. He gave me medication that would help me. Once we got home, my dad completely got rid of all the medication. I remember him going on a whole speech for about an hour saying how I shouldn't be that weak and that I should be stronger and I shouldn't complain about things. My parents both grew up in difficult situations in their country. Their mentality was what they went through, they came out fine. They didn't have to talk to anyone, so why should I have to talk to anyone?
I don't think mental health is talked about in the Latino community because we're kind of looked at as strong and macho. So it's just if you have this issue, it's just, you're just kind of looked at as weak or you're just something wrong with you, it's never been an option to go to a therapist.
It's deemed as feminine if you speak about feeling sad or anything, so most families or most cultures don't want to hear about it.
One of the other barriers to Latino families seeking out mental health services is that in the Latino communities there might be a sense of machismo and pride that we can handle our own problems. I think that sometimes in the Latino communities they're more likely to resort to alternative rituals or healers for mental health guidance as opposed to seeking out social workers or psychologists to get help.
It's because of lack of education. They don't have enough information. They don't know different types of mental illnesses that are out there. For example, if someone is depressed, that's a mental illness up to a certain point. They don't consider it that. No, you have to man up. No, you have to be strong. Forget about it. That's in the past, blah, blah, blah. And what they don't realize is that every individual responds to things differently.
I've definitely gotten better through speaking to someone. Before, I was a really quiet person. I was really shy. I was really anxious. I couldn't speak to people because I would freak out about it. My personality, I had a complete 180. You would not recognize the person before I was seeking out help and then the person I am now. And it really helped me, I guess, grow into myself and realize that, it's kind of more than just a sadness or a worry.
That piece definitely adds an additional layer to our understanding of how stigma creates a barrier for youth access to mental health. And I can speak personally as a Latina woman that it took me quite some time before I was comfortable enough, addressing some of my issues with depression. I now take a daily SSRI, an antidepressant medication, and I see a therapist weekly. And I'm very vocal now about reducing stigma around, mental health treatment and services, but it took quite a long time until I was comfortable with that. Let's go ahead and jump back into our conversation. Dr. Pastor, I'd like to start with you. You've done a lot of research with immigrant communities who are a large part of Southern California's population. Can you speak a little about how systems are structured that would make it difficult for immigrant communities to access the services that they need?
Well, again, I think that video really spoke so much to the circumstances that people face. It is a combination of a lack of resources that are in communities so that people can easily access them. There's also, in particular for immigrants, fear about accessing services when you lack legal status or if somebody in your family does. People don't realize that 18% of Los Angeles County is either undocumented themselves or living with a family member who's undocumented. And they are worried that if they tap into a service, that it's going to wind up uncovering their status and leading to a really stressful event, which is a deportation. There's also these cultural things that you've talked about with regard to feeling like, if your parents were able to cross the border and get through some difficult circumstances, who are you to complain about a little bit of stress as a high school student? But I think that these things need to be lifted up. They need to be brought forward. And I really, really want to praise Roshan for not just talking about resources, but about demonstrating the courage that it takes to speak about your situation, to put it out there, to make sure that people see it, because what it does is it makes other people be invited to share their own story and to feel like it's possible to understand their stress and their challenges, not as a result of their individual problems, but as a result of these larger social structures that make it difficult to live.
Catherine, over to you. Could you speak a little bit about how you see these impacts in the work that you do?
Yes. So it makes it harder for KFAM to reach the community members who need the support and care. When there's a lack of services in language and resources that are not culturally competent to the Asian American communities, it implies mental health care services are not meant to be used by Asian Americans. When there is this disconnect, it makes it even harder and almost impossible for individuals to ask for help because mental health care services are not readily available.
I'd love to kind of open this up and talk a little bit specifically about how the COVID-19 pandemic this past year, and of course, the national conversation about race relations in this country has brought into the spotlight, some of our greatest inequities. So I'd love to know, maybe from each of you, how have you seen the events of this past year impact your community, impact yourself personally with regard to mental health?
Well, I think the most obvious is people losing their jobs and not having adequate healthcare. Um, I know I experienced a couple of people getting sick and they wasn't sure if it was COVID or something else, but they didn't have healthcare to even go and check it out.
Yeah. Catherine?
And like in this past year with the increase of Asian hate crimes, racial trauma is really increasing in the Asian American communities. And our clinical counseling wait list continues to grow. We see a lot of individuals, community members who are fearful to do day-to-day activities. They limit their time spent outside of their homes. They're looking over their shoulders and increasing their awareness of their surroundings. And these feelings and emotions are causing more anxiety. It's leading to depression symptoms. More community members are isolating themselves and causing PTSD. So it is really strongly affecting and hurting the mental health of our community members.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Dr. Pastor, I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this topic.
Well, I think the last year has revealed so much in terms of the economic disparities that are conflicting, that are affecting our country, the racial disparities in terms of policing, in terms of the anti-Asian hate that Catherine was talking about, and in terms of the way that COVID affected communities. So we've learned so much about what people call the structural determinants of health, including mental health. But the thing I'm really taking away from this year is the following. We need to learn more about what determines those structural determinants. Yes, we know that racial disparity affects vulnerability. We know that economic insecurity impacts health. But what do we need to do to change those conditions? And the answer is community organizing. The answer is social movement building. The answer is changing power in the country, because we already have a lot of research about the structural determinants of health. What we need to do now is to change those structural determinants, to create a more equitable economy, to deal with the racism that's been affecting us, to make sure that health access is open to all, to destigmatize mental health. And that is going to take a movement. It's going to take a movement of adults, but it's going to in particular take a movement of young people who point us the way to a different kind of future.
And Roshan, you really are on the front lines of this movement. I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit more to the experience, even the transition of being a young person seeking services and now being a young person speaking out about these issues.
Well, yeah, sure. My journey really started when I went to community college, and there were people, speaking, well, professors, talking about mental health because I am a psychology student too. So just learning about it and becoming aware, it made me realize, hey, maybe I should talk to somebody and it's okay to talk to somebody. And Dr. Pastor, what you said as far as like when you speak out about it, other people can confirm if they share similarities with you. And from there, you just kind of, I guess, continue on the journey. So I have no shame speaking about anything that I've been through up in the past or even current challenges that I'm faced with now, right? Because life, it's a continual journey. I feel like we're always going to go through things, but it's about gaining the proper tools to help you get.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm wondering are there any other barriers that we haven't yet mentioned? We've been talking about these big structural barriers, some of the cultural concerns. Is there anything else anybody has to contribute that we haven't mentioned so far that does kind of bear mentioning?
I think it kind of goes in with the whole stigma, but I would want to talk about like the media's portrayal on mental health. Because mental health is often stereotyped, that it's like only for individuals with extreme conditions or that mental illness is not treatable. And so it's often inaccurately portrayed, which then creates barriers for people who would want to receive professional help, but it stops them because of these stereotypes that we see in movies and TV shows and in the newspaper and what we read.
Before we wrap up our first panel of the evening, I do have one final question for our guests. So for each of you, what would you say is the biggest change that we should address when it comes to mental health access for Southern California's young people?
I would say mental health advocates have been institutions where that's their primary job is to make people aware of the mental health resources that's available and even just quick tips on how to cope with certain situations because it can be something very, very small that can lead to long-term chronic illnesses if it goes untreated, such as depression or anxiety.
And to add to that, I would say really what Roshan was saying about normalizing mental health care services and kind of embedding the idea that mental health is your physical health. It's not two different distinctions and that they are the same and they work together the same way. And, some things that I always think about is just to increase funding to support various languages and have, cultural responsive integrated care in mental health care and to have those kind of services available with resources.
The thing I would add is about changing our broader narrative. We often celebrate young people who we say beat the odds, and that's great. But I think we ought to also be celebrating young people who change the odds, who do the community organizing, social movement building that shift the structures that make it more possible for everybody to succeed. And one of the things my colleague Veronica Tarikas, who studies youth organizing, has found is that when young people do social justice organizing, it makes them more resilient.
People, saying, well, professors, talking about mental health because I am a psychology student too. So just learning about it and becoming aware, it made me realize, hey, maybe I should talk to somebody and it's okay to talk to somebody. And Dr. Pastor, what you said as far as like when you speak out about it, other people can confirm if they share similarities with you. And from there, you just kind of, I guess, continue on the journey. So I have no shame speaking about anything that I've been through up in the past or even current challenges that I'm faced with now, right? Because life, it's a continual journey. I feel like we're always going to go through things, but it's about gaining the proper tools to help you get.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm wondering are there any other barriers that we haven't yet mentioned? We've been talking about these big structural barriers, some of the cultural concerns. Is there anything else anybody has to contribute that we haven't mentioned so far that does kind of bear mentioning?
I think it kind of goes in with the whole stigma, but I would want to talk about like the media's portrayal on mental health. Because mental health is often stereotyped, that it's like only for individuals with extreme conditions or that mental illness is not treatable. And so it's often inaccurately portrayed, which then creates barriers for people who would want to receive professional help, but it stops them because of these stereotypes that we see in movies and TV shows and in the newspaper and what we read.
Before we wrap up our first panel of the evening, I do have one final question for our guests. So for each of you, what would you say is the biggest change that we should address when it comes to mental health access for Southern California's young people?
I would say mental health advocates have been institutions where that's their primary job is to make people aware of the mental health resources that's available and even just quick tips on how to cope with certain situations because it can be something very, very small that can lead to long-term chronic illnesses if it goes untreated, such as depression or anxiety.
And to add to that, I would say really what Roshan was saying about normalizing mental health care services and kind of embedding the idea that mental health is your physical health. It's not two different distinctions and that they are the same and they work together the same way. And, some things that I always think about is just to increase funding to support various languages and have, cultural responsive integrated care in mental health care and to have those kind of services available with resources.
The thing I would add is about changing our broader narrative. We often celebrate young people who we say beat the odds, and that's great. But I think we ought to also be celebrating young people who change the odds, who do the community organizing, social movement building that shift the structures that make it more possible for everybody to succeed. And one of the things my colleague Veronica Tarikas, who studies youth organizing, has found is that when young people do social justice organizing, it makes them more resilient, makes them feel more powerful, makes them have an understanding of the structures that have gotten in their way. And so I think looking at Roshan having this wonderful conversation, I know or feel like part of the journey for you to be able to deal with your own mental health issues was to see it as part of a larger structure and to feel like you're part of changing that for everyone. And when people feel that, they're able to succeed individually. But that means we need to move from this Horatio Alger, how wonderful that this one kid made it, they beat the odds, to what is our responsibility as a society to change the odds to make it possible for everyone to succeed and be healthy in terms of their body, their mind, and their soul.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. I'd love to take this opportunity to thank you all, Dr. Manuel Pastor, Catherine Yum, and Roshan Davis for joining us this evening and for their honest and thoughtful answers. We hope that this profound discussion was inspirational and that you consider sharing about your own journey with the Well-Being Story Wall. Take a look at how you can be a part of the conversation.
The We Are Wellbeing's Story Wall is a central part of the wellbeings.org website, social media platform, and the Wellbeings National Tour. We are asking the public of all ages to submit personal reflections, videos, photos, and short stories to offer hope, to foster understanding, to build community, and break down stigma.
What does being well mean to you? What is the one thing you wish people knew about mental health? What is your passion? What's your story?
Video can easily be submitted via social media using the hashtag #wellbeings or emailed to info@wellbeings.org.
Stories can also be submitted by uploading to Dropbox and live at Wellbeings Tour events. The We Are Wellbeing Story Wall is made possible through generous support provided by Wellbeing's Youth Mental Health Project founding corporate sponsor Otska and Wellbeing's media partner People.
What's up, guys? It's 24K Golden. Depression doesn't discriminate. It can affect anyone and everyone, so don't give up on yourself and don't give up on your friends. Reach out to people. You can find help. It's okay to talk about it. Go to findyourwords.org.
PBS SoCal and KCET, along with Wellbeings, have created a resource toolkit to help you or those you care about find mental health resources, both nationally and right here in our Southern California community. This mental health resource toolkit can be found at wellbeings.org/PBS SoCal-resources.
Hey everybody, this is Miley Cyrus. Mental health struggles can be hard to put into words, but we have to talk about them. You never know the difference one conversation can make. Be a part of the change. If you're feeling down or are in need of support or looking for tips on how to help someone who's struggling, go to findyourwords.org.
We've spoken quite a bit about barriers that make it hard for low-income youth and youth of color to access the mental health services they need. But as promised, we want to spend the rest of our time today discussing solutions to those challenges. I'd like to hand over the mic to a budding journalist who will focus on available resources and ways to address inequities in the system. Andre Tinoco is an alum of the PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Labs program. Over to you, Andre.
Thank you, Kara. As Kara mentioned, my name is Andre Tinoco. I'm a student reporter studying journalism at Mount San Antonio College. Today, we're going to dig into work being done not just on an individual or community level, but also a structural level to address some of the barriers that we just learned about. To start, we were fortunate enough to have Dr. Tom Insel, who is the mental health czar of California, speaking with PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Lab reporter Julia Escobar. Let's join them in their conversation on barriers and solutions.
Hello, I am PBS NewsHour student reporter Julia Escobar from Venice High School. Today I have the honor of speaking with Dr. Thomas Insel. Since you were the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, based on your experiences, what are the changes you would like to see in our healthcare system overall and then specifically related to youth?
Oh, I really like that question. And I'm not sure I really understood it when I was at the National Institute of Mental Health, but I've done a lot of traveling through California since then. And I had a chance to meet people in homeless shelters and clubhouses and places that unfortunately include jails and prisons, and heard from a lot of people struggling with mental health issues that are not in the care system. And I began to realize that, there's a difference between mental health and mental health care. That in a way, mental health care is like where it's like the repair shop, right? It's where the equivalent would be if you had the metaphor of your car. It's you take the car into the repair shop when it breaks down. But what we really ought to be thinking about is how do you make sure the highways are really working well for people? So it's that mental health itself has much less to do with the repair shop and much more to do with creating all of those things in the world that allow people to function well. So making sure that, like we were just talking about, in terms of if you think about what's useful to people, that you don't wait until there's a crisis to intervene. You make sure that people who are struggling have access to peers and to providers who can be useful. You think about what I call the 3 Ps: people, place, and purpose. That's really the essence of what you're going to need for mental health. People being that you've got friends, you've got social support, you've got somebody watching your back. Places that you've got some place safe, free of toxic stress, free of a lot of the challenges that come with poverty and racism and social injustice. And then purpose is super important, particularly for young people, that they realize that they have a mission, they have something to live for. It's such a critical piece. And what I'd love to see as we go forward is that even though we think about these problems kind of from a medical perspective, because in fact they are medical in the sense that we expect health insurance to support their solutions. The actual solutions are not medical. So the problem is medical, but the solutions are social, they're environmental, they're political, there are a whole bunch of other things that we need to have in the mix for mental health to prevail. It's much more than just traditional mental health care.
Who do you think, or how do you think we are the US is going to get there? Because like you said, we have the technology and we have a lot of the resources, but we don't have the push to put them out. What do you think, or who do you think needs to be a part of that to make it nationally known, or to make it accessible, or to make it available?
Well, we need a social movement. So the answer to who is you. It's social movements never work from the top down. They only work from the bottom up. It takes people like you who care about this issue to spread the message, motivate others, and create not just awareness, but action to say, hey, we need this course in our school. Hey, we need to make sure we don't lose another student to suicide. There are things we can do to make sure that doesn't happen. It's not going to happen from administrators and teachers and governments. It's partly because they're just so busy with other stuff, and this isn't top of mind for them. So you guys, you and others have got to sort of pick this up, pick the mantle up, and really run with it. We need a social movement. You can think a lot about the civil rights movement, which is a wonderful model for what we need here. In the civil rights movement, people didn't talk about stigma. They talked about discrimination. They didn't talk about access. They talked about rights and equality and equity. And that's the language we need. We need to shift our language so that we're really fighting for something here that ensures that students get what they deserve, and that we start to say, hey, you know what? Mental wellness, mental fitness is every bit as important as physical fitness. We invest an awful lot in our football teams and our basketball teams, but what about those teams that are supporting each other, our peers? What about people who are just going to commit to make sure we won't lose another student to suicide. We won't lose another student to dropping out of school. Mental disorders, mental issues are the number one reason why students drop out. They don't graduate in terms of medical issues, number one. So we've got to undo that. And when I say we, it's all of us. It's not going to happen from the government. It's not going to happen from the administration. It's going to happen when we create this movement and students begin to demand it.
That video we just watched really exemplifies the layers to the conversation about mental health access and the work that needs to be done. Our next panel can speak to some of the on-the-ground work being done to address these challenges. Joining me today to continue this conversation, one, she's a familiar face. We saw her just a few moments ago, Catherine Young. She's the Executive Director of the Korean American Family Services. Catherine, welcome. Janae Oliver, founder of Mindful Beauty, and Dr. Jorge Partida del Toro. He is the Chief of Psychology for the LA Department of Mental Health. Thank you all so much for joining us. Let's dive right in. So our previous panel talked about a variety of barriers in terms of the individual, community, and even structural level. So let's break down some of what we heard. This first question is for each of you. We've heard a lot about the need to normalize services and kind of treat mental health the same as we treat our physical health. Catherine, I'll start with you because I know you mentioned this earlier. So how in your work are you trying to normalize both mental health and accessing mental health services?
And before I jump into that question, KFAM's core work is in mental health clinical counseling, domestic and family violence, child and adult physical and mental wellness, and Asian foster care. To jump into the answer, at KFAM, we try to normalize mental health by educating our community of KFAM's mental health care services, reminding them we have counselors who have a shared understanding of their cultural values. We bring more awareness around therapy through workshops and seminars, talking about healthy outlets and finding coping skills and tools. And every day, we work to break cultural stigma that it's okay to get professional help, which is a foreign concept to the AAPI community.
Janae, anything to add on that?
Sure, thank you. I started a collaborative organization called Mindful Beauty, and it was designed to train hairstylists to look at the signs and symptoms of depression in their clients. And it was a project that I developed out of being a public health student at Charles Drew University of Medicine and Science, where we were looking at depression in Black women and recognizing that more Black women were experiencing severe and major depression when compared to other race and ethnic groups. And so what that meant is that they weren't getting timely access to adequate and quality mental health care services. So I reflected on my childhood of growing up with a sister who was a budding hairstylist, and I was her first client, really, and she experimented on me quite a bit. So I learned a lot about the hair industry and how Black women frequent hair salons and the ways in which they engage with one another, and the many times in a month that a Black woman goes to a hair salon. And in that, it was clear to me that there was more to it than just getting your hair done. It was actually getting a deeper level of connection, and there was relationship building there. And so we designed this program to really normalize what connections to mental health could be for our community, and how we could increase access to Black women, particularly in South LA.
Dr. Partida, can you speak a little bit on how you're trying to normalize both mental health and accessing mental health services?
Sure, absolutely. So, the Department of Mental Health is the largest department of mental health in the nation, serving more than 10 million citizens, residents of LA County, regardless of ability to pay. And I think that, we're always seeking to provide services that are culturally and linguistically relevant to the populations that we serve. I think, really creating posters that have been on buses, allowing for events such as We Rise and conversations to take place that really bring the conversation of mental health and mental wellness into our communities, particularly those communities, as has already been mentioned, where it's still so much of a stigma in communities of color to talk about mental health. So for us to create community events, to talk about normalizing, to have PSAs in the media, all are ways for us to really, I think, as has been said, that mental health is not just for those individuals that are severely ill, but that all of us really need to take stock and inventory of our mental well-being, because it's so critical to all our rights as residents and citizens of this country.
Dr. Partida, this past year has really had a lot of fear and trauma being just thrown on all of us, whether that's from COVID or even rising AAPI hate crimes and the conversation about racism in this country. How can young people from communities of color process the trauma of what we experienced this past year?
I think it's been stated before, Dr. Puente, we saw in the first panel talking about the importance of really bringing young people into a movement. I think that that's really critical. So much of the conversation often goes unobserved. We don't really know what mental health has done to us because we're not allowed to check within. We're always so focused on checking out the environment and everything else around us, right? And I think for people of color, the idea of collective racism and the collective experience of our ancestors passed on generation to generation oftentimes makes it very difficult for us to relate that the experience of collective racism, of colonization, of oppression have much to do also with our own lived mental health. So I think to be able to begin to have conversations that allow for us permission to look within and to talk about these issues in a very open manner, and to begin to think about how systemic racism continues to play a role in all of our lives, and how we can begin to really break down the systemic oppression that happens. Like, that is really critical. Giving permission, giving voice, allowing spaces for these difficult dialogues to take place, I think is really important. And young people are really critical for this because they're the ones that are in a position to really shift the consciousness and move the conversation in that direction.
Dr. Partida, I love that you said, creating a space and also having that conversation. Really, Janae, your organization, Mindful Beauty, is very grassroots. Can you kind of speak to that specifically and what you and your organization deal with and how you address how creating community and safe spaces can really help young people?
Absolutely. So first, I just want to call out that, we call it grassroots, but really the collaborative of organizations that came together to invest in Mindful Beauty have collectively about 90 years of experience. And so they're really rooted in community. Charleston University of Medicine and Science have been educating young people in our community for many years. Many of them go on to become medical students. California Black Women's Health Project is a nonprofit organization that has been training young Black women to be advocates around mental health. And I actually went through the program, graduated when I was in my 20s. And then the Black Beauty Shop Health Foundation is a nonprofit that has been connecting with a number of hair salons throughout the state of California. And so When we think about the ways in which these organizations have been operating, specifically around mental health, they provide sister circles where Black women can come together and have comfortable conversations about what mental health looks like in their own reality, right? And based on their shared experiences. It's not always comfortable to go into a therapy room and, talk to someone who doesn't understand what Dr. Partito was talking about around racism, right? They don't understand these shared experiences, the lived experiences of Black women who have been in many ways ostracized out of society. And so we, through this Mindful Beauty program, decided to train Black women hairstylists to understand the signs and the symptoms of depression and create that space where they can have shared learning with one another as they're providing services to their clients. And so we've seen some great outcomes so far. We know that this is a best practice, and it really is just about lifting up more of these kinds of practices that we know are working and that we can provide the evidence for in our communities. And so more to come on that for sure.
I love that. Thank you. Catherine, can you kind of address that from an organizational kind of viewpoint?
Sure. So, KFEM creates a community by providing a safe place for individuals who have shared interests, similar cultures, and shared life experiences. And we've, helped form an identity and trust through culturally competent and in-language services. And we also help create a network of support and social connections for individuals to build a community.
Thank you. I really love that. Even though there's two different ways, Janae, you're there intimately, creating safe spaces. Catherine, we're just kind of all there to really provide these spaces for everyone. I want to go to Dr. Partita. The Why We Rise campaign is trying to create conversation about mental health through art. Can you speak to how that campaign is trying to build community and destigmatize mental health?
Absolutely. So We Rise is one of the cornerstone initiatives of the department. It is in its 4th year of existence, and it is a wonderful way to celebrate May, which is, Mental Health Month. This event brings together artists, and there's no more powerful way to describe how mental health really oftentimes has no words, that people that have lived through this experience of mental illness can really create art, and that art can really speak to the experience that beyond words. We Rise was one of the first events I ever went to before I was an employee, and I was just struck by the artist's way of describing without words the images of depression, what that looks like, the images of domestic violence, of abuse, and how these images that cut across culture, that say the things that we can't say, really kind of speak to normalizing and uplifting voices that oftentimes are not heard. So I really encourage everybody to attend We Rise. There are over 18 installations that have been placed out in safe spacing, family friendly, but really do check it out. There's speakers, there's virtual events and live events. If you want to find out more information about We Rise, check out werise.la.
Our panel so far has discussed ways to make change, and we're going to join a conversation with Kaiser Permanente child psychiatrist Dr. Kumar and his daughter Sasha, who's a high school senior who volunteers her time in the mental health space to share their thoughts on this topic. We will now join PBS NewsHour reporter Zhenwei Gao in her interview with Dr. Kumar and Sasha. Let's take a look.
I'm here today with Kaiser Permanente child psychiatrist Dr. Kumar and his daughter Sasha. Sasha is a strong advocate in mental health advocacy. So thank you so much both for being here today. Hi, Dr. Kumar.
Hi, Janvi. Thank you for inviting Sasha and myself for this important conversation.
Of course. And hi, Sasha. Nice to meet you.
Hi, thank you so much for having us both.
in your 30 years of practice, have you noticed any changes in the way that young people view their mental health? Also parents regards to that matter as well?
I have seen a lot of changes in over 30 years. In the beginning, I used to see patients who had more, I would call it noticeable problems like autism, impact of seizure disorders or developmental delays. And but now over a period of last 2 or 3 decades, I have seen a significant change that people are coming a lot more for academic difficulties, learning problems, uh, anxiety, depression, substance use, body image disturbance. So we are seeing that there is a lot more acceptance to come for mental health resources when you have these problems. And also there is policy changes. So we all the school districts now have a special education department to address these things at a much deeper level, at an earlier level, things which we did not have before.
Sasha, so you mentioned your volunteer work with NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Do you mind going more in details about your involvement with the organization? What does it do?
I've been part of NAMI for my high school years now, and I really enjoy it. I think what we have done with our club, especially with the people who lead it, is bring together more conversations that involve a wider group of people. And we include things from Zoom fatigue, just how stressful school can be, to body image, and to how we can perceive ourselves to be the greater image, and how to work on our mental health. It's really proved to be successful, especially for me and my friends. And I've gotten to witness a lot of these people who join the club and come to the meetings experience a lot more relief from the anxiety that they were feeling or the sadness that they may have been going through. And it also helps everyone work on skills that are necessary for building a stronger mental health and wellness, and proving that self-care is something necessary for everyone.
What have you learned from Sasha about mental health, specifically youth mental health?
Sasha, because of you, I have learned a lot. I have learned how widespread and prevalent conversations are amongst youth about anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and they often talk about from each other and how to seek help. As Sasha started growing up, she was asking me the questions like, what should I tell my friends? How can they get help? And more I thought about it, more I started understanding that when we ask our youth to go and ask a responsible adult, we have done very little effort in preparing our adults around these children, like parents, coaches, and teachers, into how to identify the problems early and treat it early so that the resolution can be there sooner.
Within the youth community, what do you think is the most important thing that young people can do to sort of change the conversation around mental health?
I think young people can actually work on discussing it with their responsible adults about how do we need to destigmatize about mental health issues. It's okay to talk about mental health issues, and at a school level, at their club level, being more engaged. I have seen through Sasha how she is involved with different clubs like youth and government, and understanding what policy means. And Genway, I am actually impressed what you are doing through part of well-being is discussing that. I think more we all do these kind of activities, which allows people to destigmatize mental health issues and also bring people together and understand that they are not alone when they are struggling with these issues. There are others, and then working with your peer group is the best way for teenagers to get help.
One of the things I think is extremely important about decreasing the stigma around mental health, and I've seen this firsthand because of NAMI, which is just a big club at our school and has a lot of impact, is the community that we can build with the youth is so valuable, and it comes through shared experiences, and it comes through a lot of just common understanding of other people. And our generation and my peers especially have just done wonderfully at explaining to each other that this is what I'm going through, this is what I need help with. And it helps really decrease the stigma. And I'm really proud to see how many people are no longer afraid to talk about things that they're struggling with and that they need help or things like that.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today in regards to mental health, which is such an important topic. Thank you, Dr. Kumar, and thank you, Sasha.
I really love how this was an intergenerational conversation, really about mental health. My next question is for you, Janae. What can adults do to support youth in their lives?
So I think the first thing that adults can do is really to make sure that they're taking good care of themselves, right? When you get on a plane, what's the first thing that they tell you? Put the oxygen mask on yourself first. And so I think for those adults who have younger people in their care, whether they're at a school site or in their homes or out in the community, to always be that example of what self-care can actually look like. And that can mean, making sure that it's very difficult in our communities where, there's so much interdependence, right? Where communities are, and individuals, and especially Black women, we're used to like caretaking for one another. And so to be able to step back and say, I'm going to do something for me, knowing that I can't shoulder all of the, burdens of my community or of my family, even though, I'm trying to support them, maybe financially or just, emotionally. So we have to be able to take that step back. And I think the other thing that adults, particularly those who are working in institutions, is that they can really look at what is the power that I have with where I'm sitting from where I am. And how can I take that power and make it transferable to someone who is younger, right? I'm making decisions every single day in the work that I'm doing around policies, around grant investments in philanthropic organizations or in government services. And so what types of decisions do you need to be thinking about that impact the life of young people every single day? And how do you bring them to the table, invite them to the conversation when they're not there? Many different ways that we can begin to think, we're adults, but really trying to engage the youth and make sure that their voices are heard and that their needs are being met.
In the video we just watched, Sasha spoke about the strength she found being part of a community, which kind of echoes what Dr. Pastor said earlier about, I think he said, quote, when youth are involved in organizing, it makes them more resilient and powerful. Catherine, how do you see the power of organizing in your work?
We see this power in our youth at KFAM through mentoring or tutoring for our foster children, high school clubs leading our food box distributions to seniors, and sharing experience to other youth. Like at our college readiness seminar, where current college students are panelists who speak to current high schoolers about college life, mental health, and self-care. What we notice is that when youth connect with each other, it's at a different level, and they open up about issues they wouldn't talk to adults about. So we see a lot of, youth leading youth being very empowering, and how it really does help youth, become more familiar with their community, which helps define their, emotional and social intelligence and define their relationship to society.
Dr. Partida, in our previous panel, we talked about how immigrant communities may fear accessing services because it may put themselves or even their loved ones at risk of deportation. I wanted to ask, can you speak to this as a service provider and kind of your perspective on that?
Yes, I think that's a very, well-founded fear in the immigrant community, because it has actually been perpetuated in the past years, right? That immigrants have been told they're not welcome to receive medical care, they're not welcome to receive public services. And for those that are seeking, that are undocumented, that are seeking legal pathway to residency and citizenship. They don't want to be a burden, financial burden that would disqualify them from applications. So the idea is not unfounded. However, I do think that it's so important that people understand that in LA County, you don't have to have a legal residency. You don't have to have ability to pay. It is really critical for immigrant communities to come out and face these fears and really recognize that we are a safe space to come and seek help. LA County, the Department of Mental Health provides services in 13 anchor languages. And so, but I think that, really being able to fight the fear that has been so well implemented into our communities is also our responsibility. We can't just put the burden on immigrant communities. The Department of Mental Health, we have a responsibility to really go into communities and make ourselves accessible, make ourselves user-friendly, and teach our communities by hiring people that look like the communities that we serve, that speak the languages of our communities, that come from our communities, to be able to deliver services in a culturally and linguistically relevant manner to make mental health and mental well-being accessible for all.
I love that you said, making it accessible for all. Janae, Mindful Beauty approaches mental stigma by equipping Black women with training to recognize mental health challenges and connect to resources. How do you see your work addressing structural inequity?
Ooh, how much time do we have? So I think a lot of mindful beauty really does get at the root problem, right? We had a number of years throughout our history where Black women were excluded from mental health care services and healthcare in general. And now we tell them, come to the table and, come and access our healthcare, right? And I think when we heard from Dr. Kamara Jones, she talks about racism being the ways in which some groups are receiving, structurally advantaged just based on their skin color versus those who are not, and where there are structural disadvantages. And it saps the strength of the whole society. And so when you think about what mindful beauty does, and we heard this a little bit from Manuel Pastor, is that it really is thinking about restructuring the ways in which we provide access to mental health care services. We can no longer look at the traditional practices within healthcare systems or in community. We have to get creative and we have to get innovative. Black women are going to hair salons 2 to 3 times a month, right? Well, pre-COVID, right? going into these hair salons. And many times the hairstylist is the one person that Black women might experience in a more intimate way. They're touching their scalp, they're touching their hair. And that is not commonplace, right? They may not see their physician for a whole year, but they will definitely see their hairstylist. And so how do we kind of build upon these practices where we are acknowledging the ways in which Black women are engaging in their communities, right? And the ways in which they get health care information. It's not always from the doctor. It is definitely from your hairstylist. It could be from a barber. It could be from your post office person, right? And so we have to think more critically about what are the access points. And the more that we can do that, I think the more we begin to kind of chip away at those structural inequities, because it didn't happen overnight, right? It happened because of years of racism, structural racism, policies, practices, institutions, and it's not about blame and shame, but it definitely is about acknowledging that and holding our organizations accountable to do much better. And so here we are with Mindful Beauty. After 2 years, we've trained 12 hairstylists, and they're continuing to support their clients even during COVID-19. And so we're really proud of the work that they've been able to do.
Another big theme that came up was funding for mental health services. And in his recent budget proposal revisions, California Governor Gavin Newsom proposed increased funding for mental health so that all youth under the age of 26 can have access to therapy and other services. Dr. Partita, the governor's proposal specifies partnering with county mental health agencies. So my question is, how could adding additional funding to LA County's Department of Mental Health help more youth?
Well, I think, the county serves children 0 to 15 and then transitional youth 16 to 25. So increased funding, I think, can really create the space for this youth care system really to be revamped and reimagined. I think that it's so necessary. It's not okay that so many children of color are in our juvenile justice system or in our child welfare system. And we have to really reimagine these systems to be able to provide more culturally relevant, culturally informed care. And I think that increased funding will certainly allow for us to have more providers that look like the children that are being served and have a way of really reunifying children with families that are often broken because of the same social systems that have disempowered them, from injustices to poverty to lack of access to care. So all of this, I think, can be reimagined, and increased funding will allow us to do that. We already in the county partner a great deal with the state of California, and I think that collaborative relationship is going to really just be much more integrated and organic. So I really look forward to that possibility, because I think it's an injustice that needs to stop. Really, our young people are our future, but if they're oppressed by being in these juvenile justice systems or in foster homes or in all of these sort of oppressive systems, then we're really capping our own future. We're really capping our own future. We have kids that drop out, children of color that drop out of high school at alarming rates, 50%, 45%. This is unacceptable, because all we're doing is just feeding a system that is not going to empower them. So clearly this will allow us to reimagine the system and really begin to provide a healthy future for our youth.
Catherine, in the previous panel, you spoke about media depictions of mental health and how that can be a barrier to normalizing mental health conversations. So how should media be addressing mental health? And can you think of positive or layered mental health depictions in media?
Sure. So instead of stereotyping and distorting mental health illnesses, media should bring positivity on how mental health conditions can occur in anyone. Mental health does not discriminate, and that these conditions can be treatable and manageable, meaning individuals can continue to function in their daily lives with a mental health condition. And, trying to think on top of my head, some media that portray mental health conditions in a more positive way are movies like Inside Out, The Skeleton Twins, and A Beautiful Mind. But, I wish I could name more, but that just shows how media doesn't do a good job portraying mental health to the public.
Thank you, Catherine. And before we begin wrapping up, I really want to ask Janae, what advice would you give to young people who may be trying to talk to the adults in their lives about mental health, but kind of feel unheard or even dismissed?
So I think with youth, it is more about making your voice heard. Figure out what is going on in your community already. There are a number of nonprofit organizations that I even work with in my capacity as a community health manager through Kaiser Permanente. And these are organizations that are doing great work. I would love to do a roll call. The ones that I'm thinking of are Positive Results Corporation, and Cal State Dominguez Hills has a Male Success Alliance program. So many organizations are doing really great work. And so get involved, figure out, who is reaching youth. right? And who might listen to you. And so I know that there are probably individuals on your school campuses. Kaiser Permanente does have a initiative called Thriving Schools. And in many ways, we're trying to make sure that we do connect young people to adults who are healthy mentally and can provide the necessary support and intervention so that young people do not go down a path where they're experiencing, negative behaviors. They're practicing negative behaviors. They're not necessarily getting the support that they need, maybe in the home. And so there are a number of ways that youth can just really be. I mean, social media, right? Social media is such a huge communication channel for young folks. They are constantly doing TikToks and Facebook and Instagram, and so come up with something catchy where it's going to reach not only your audience, but also thinking about like who are the adults that need to hear the message and hear what concerns me on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of those concerns are very similar to what adults experience, right? In different ways, but I'm sure that they could relate to that. We're dealing with the housing crisis in Los Angeles County. We're dealing with food insecurity. And so how can you as young people kind of lift up that, look at how this is impacting me, right? Look at how, I'm struggling to figure out how to get my next meal or where I'm going to lay my head and how that impacts the ways in which I'm going to be able to function in a school. And so I think there are just so many ways that young people, we heard about art, but young people definitely have the creativity. They have new knowledge, new ways of engaging in community. And so get involved, and make your voices heard.
Catherine, do you have anything that you would like to add to that, to someone who, even a child to a parent, questioning whether they should even approach their parent, or, what steps can they take, or how would you recommend them doing that?
I think it's really important to just really open up. So talk about what you're struggling with, what emotions are you feeling, and really bring up conversations, whether it be your friends or your family members. And then it's really also important to talk about these kind of things with people in your group at school, to bring more awareness around about like how you feel, why you feel this way, and talking about like how important emotions and the mental health wellness is for that person. Because I think if any parent heard that my child is sad because of what's going on in the news, they will be willing to listen. They will not brush that away. So I think having open conversations, and it has to be very open, deep, and frank about it, which I know it's really hard in all cultures. But I think that is one of the first steps, is to really personalize it and bring up how you're feeling and why you feel that way.
Dr. Bartita?
I think, Catherine, that's right on. I would add that, the really teaching parents to value emotional intelligence and to create the safe spaces for children to begin to learn to identify feelings and emotions early on allows for that permission that Catherine mentioned to take place. I think for our young people also to begin to recognize the value of speaking out and speaking out is really important. We, instead of just, I hear so many times, the people talk about people of color and their resiliency, and, yes, we are resilient people and we overcome, but enough of overcoming, right? There's also important to address the vulnerabilities and to recognize that, yeah, there's no need for us to be so overcoming and really kind of resilient if we weren't exposed to so much trauma and so much abuse. And so it's also important to say enough is enough. And it's also important to give young people the voice and the spaces to be able to say, I am not okay, and I am hurting, and I need help. I think so oftentimes, we do, as has been stated in this panel and in the previous panel, really look to young people and say, well, you can toughen it up, and you'll get over this, or it's no big deal. it is a big deal. We have been through some very traumatic instances. And I think that, as Dr. Puente pointed out, this pandemic really highlighted so many of the coexisting and pre-existing vulnerabilities in our system. And I think it's so important for us to really create that space where talking about these issues, and especially teaching young people emotional intelligence, is so, so critical.
Well, Dr. Partida, thank you so much. And thank you, Catherine and Janae, for sharing your expertise with us and being part of the Wellbeing's Tour mission to demystify and destigmatize our physical and mental health through storytelling. So thank you. Before we end for the evening, we have a preview from the upcoming Ken Burns documentary, Hiding in Plain Sight, which will air in spring of 2022. This film looks at the experiences of young people living with mental health conditions with a focus on the importance of awareness and compassion. It shines a clear light on what life is like for young people featured in the film, as well as for the parents, teachers, friends, and healthcare providers in their lives. I am so glad I could host this conversation on youth mental health. My name is Andre Tinoco, and now Hiding in Plain Sight.
I think there's so many things you can say about mental illness. It comes out of nowhere, and then it just creeps into your body, and you don't know how to deal with it.
It's a strange thing to look back on and think to myself, I really didn't care about anything at that point. Not caring if I wake up.
It became a very frustrating thing whenever I'd look in the mirror and there's nothing wrong with me on the outside. There's absolutely nothing wrong to make sense of that pain.
That moment that nothing else mattered to me, that I just threw myself in front of a moving car.
I told my parents what would happen if I wasn't here.
I still had a whole future that I had planned, it's like I was planning the suicide, but at the same time, I was making plans to go out to the movies with my friends the next week.
It's hard to endure, but it's just, take it one day at a time. And that's kind of how I've been living my life.
It affects my daily life all day, every day.
When I finally did start to think oh, I'm probably an addict, I was like, no, you're just lying to yourself.
I really want to live, and I'm trying to make the effort, and I want to have a good life. Maybe 1, 2 kids, not the white picket fence, but something that's livable, not this, but I want it. And I just want normal and mundane and average. Maybe a trip to Myrtle Beach every summer. I don't care. I'm sick of crazy, chaotic, up and down mess.
There really is light. There really is. I know you're you don't know me. You have no idea of my journey. You have no idea. You're right, I don't. You're right, I don't. But I do know about lots of other kids' journeys. They are very different than yours, I'm sure of that. But what I know is that you're worth it. You have value. You are fighting this fight that you truly have no idea whether you're going to win or not. You're beyond courageous. You're beyond courageous. And you're stronger than you know. So keep the fight. Stay strong in your resolve, because you're worth it.
Thank you for joining us for the Southern California stop on the Wellbeing's Tour. We hope you enjoyed our conversation about how youth mental health is tied to the structures that shape our world and the multifaceted approaches we can and must take to ensure that young people have equitable access to mental health services. I'd like to thank our incredible panelists for being part of this event. Please remember to visit the Wellbeings website at www.wellbeings.org/PBS SoCal-resources to download the free Wellbeing Southern California Mental Health Toolkit that provides local and national support services. Please also visit the website wellbeings.org/PBS SoCal to give us your feedback on the program by filling out the short survey. Our discussion tonight is being recorded and will also be available at wellbeings.org very soon. If you've enjoyed today's conversation on mental health, we want to encourage you to tune in to another Wellbeings Tour virtual event in Southern California with KPCC and Call to Mind on May 27th. For more information, please visit wellbeings.org/KPCC. On behalf of PBS SoCal, KCET, and the Wellbeings Tour created by WETA, I'm Cara Santa Maria. Have a wonderful evening.